Welcome to False Market Value, a podcast featuring real conversation about fictional sponsorship in movies, TV, books, music, and other pop culture. I'm your host, Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting in Las Vegas. This episode is produced by DJ Cruiser from KSD Studios out of Fort Mill, South Carolina. Joining me today, my longtime pal, VP of Innovation and Business Strategy for Legends, Tom Peros. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be part of the show. I've been looking forward to this for real. We'll see how it goes, but excited to partake.
So, Tom, when you and I first started talking about doing a podcast together, we had talked about soccer and we were trying to find the right project, the right film for us to do. I think I'd initially suggested Ted Lasso, and the focus being we need to find a soccer project that we can talk about on this podcast. And we've obviously talked a lot over the years about, being girl dads, myself being a new girl dad, you being an experienced girl dad compared to my 14 months of experience currently raising a daughter, and what I might be in for when it comes to playing, I guess, youth sports, youth girl sports, and specifically as it relates to this podcast, youth women's soccer in the US, football in the UK. I want to make that distinction that we'll probably use those terms interchangeably through this discussion, but that led us to land on Bend It Like Beckham, the film that we're doing today. I watched Bend It for the first time in my 40s, so the first experience I had watching it was with my daughter and getting to see her follow what was going on screen. And that isn't true of everything that we watch together. She has interest in some things and not others. She's a big fan of Bluey. She's a big fan of Elvis. And then apparently she's a big fan of Bend It Like Beckham, watched the entire film, or at least close to it, start to finish, which was a lot of fun for me. And then rewatched it by myself in preparation for this podcast, and just, I think, had my dad hat on at the time. And the more adult parts of the film resonated with me more because I wasn't necessarily watching her identify with the women on screen. I started identifying with all the parents, which I'd like to talk about on this as well. So, Tom, how do you feel about Bend It Like Beckham? What sort of relationship did this have for your three girls?
For sure. And we certainly considered doing Ted Lasso, but felt it would have been a little too easy, though it would have been fun talking about banter. But I think, to your point about having different experience each time you watch the film, I had seen this film previously, and the first viewing was circa 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
Certainly before my time being a father. But, just as somebody that had an interest in soccer, I played soccer growing up. I'm a soccer fanatic now. I'm an average player, but really good at watching soccer on TV, whether through actual live sport or movies about soccer like Bend It Like Beckham. So, and I'm an Anglophile. I should get that out of the way. Even outside of soccer, just love experiencing and immersing myself in British culture, be it media or film or footy or soccer or whatever we're going to call it. So yeah, definitely a different experience. Had to, I watched it again in preparation for this film, but I think some of my interest was, again, being a girl dad now, including having three girls that play soccer, one who's getting pretty serious about it as a 9-year-old. I think we showed it to them during COVID for the first time, and my kids loved it, and I loved Bend It Like Beckham. So seeing it through their eyes, it was awesome. It was wonderful, and it's obviously tackles some pretty serious subject matter, but issues, but does them in a lighthearted way that you could watch it with kids and answer their questions, and all through this kind of filter or theme of soccer in the UK. So,
and I feel like it's an interesting experience, when you watch things 20 years after the fact, touching on a lot of the things that are still happening in women's football today. And as it relates to you being an Anglophile, we'll be calling upon your expertise to just explain the complicated nature of English football, English youth football, English amateur football, feeder leagues, and this rabbit hole that I did not anticipate going down after watching this film and researching the sponsorship agreements, how that works, how those teams fundraise. All of it is a lot more complicated than it sounds like it is in the United States. Obviously, the history of football in the UK is complicated in itself, but how that sport is tied into their communities, I think, is a lot different than even we would have here in the States. Soccer is huge in Las Vegas, and it's a sport you can play year round, but I still don't think it has the same impact or ties to the local community in terms of them rallying around amateur leagues as they do in the UK. And certainly we'll draw upon your expertise to touch on some of those things as we go through here, because I think it's important to understand when we're talking about sponsorship of a team like the Hounslow Harriers, which is the fictional team in this film, what that means to the club, whether that would have been the deal that that team would have had at the time that the film was made, how they tied in brands to the film in general, what's real, what's fictional, all of that's part of what we want to talk about on this particular podcast, which is, of course, the focus of it. But I think your expertise in that area is going to be a big benefit to the folks listening into this one.
Yeah, for sure. No, appreciate that. And I'm an Anglophile more than an Anglo expert, but yeah, for sure. It's all interesting to me. I mean, even, outside of doing some of my own research in preparation for this. Yeah. Like you said, football in the UK is complicated. I have a lot of close friends that watch soccer and football and are big fans of one club or another. And yeah, it's a complicated ecosystem on the men's side and certainly on the women's side. Notably, depending on how you look at the development of professional football for women in the UK, it's really, and this was kind of shocking to me because I knew about some of the soccer pyramid kind of movements over there over the last couple decades, but really they haven't had a fully professional league, a women's league in the UK till around 2018, which is mind-boggling. Even if we kind of rewind to 2002, right, in the context and era of this movie, kind of how long it took to even get to kind of a fully operational, fully professional women's soccer pyramid.
And that was part of the challenge with finding where the fictional Hounslow Harriers would fit into that pyramid structure, because it wasn't immediately clear to me. And we can touch on this when we get into just the nature of this property in general. And I think some of what they hint at in the film gives some contextual clues to how the women's team interacted with the men's team as part of that league and what that relationship was, what Joe, the coach's relationship was within the organization. Some of that is alluded to on screen, and then some of it required some research on my part, as I've mentioned before. So I think that pyramid structure is fascinating to research and certainly opened my eyes to just how much soccer is woven into the fabric of the UK and the experience growing up, and thinking about, my daughter's potential experience playing youth soccer, what her career could be if, for example, we were raising her in the UK and she had any sort of talent. The options available to her are a lot different, I think, than what the options would be for her here in the United States and in any state we're playing in, whether it's a major market or a smaller market. I think there's more of a path to success, even on the amateur side, which I found an interesting article I wanted to mention as we go through here. But with all that said, as a preamble, the movie is Bend It Like Beckham. The year is 2002. The sponsorship is the front of shirt sponsorship for AXA, ? Not entirely sure if it's the same AXA. Can't find anything talking about that, but it's AXA's shirt sponsorship of the Hounslow Harriers, a fictional team in 2002. And this is False Market Value.
Yeah, so here's an interesting bit, and I took some notes and tried to puzzle some things together with my research. It's not on a whiteboard, or I imagine Ross has something more extravagant on his wall with a lot of push pins and strings kind of connecting different pieces. But what I did see that was interesting, actually two bits of information, because like you guys did some research, could not find anything official tying that company in as far as like paid product placement or anything like that. What I did find was that the FA, the Football Association, actually was involved in the planning and production of this film. And at the time, AXA was active on the sponsorship front. They had signed actually a 4-year, £25 million deal with the Football Association I can't remember if it was circa 2000. So
yeah, it was 98 to 02, I think.
Right, which is interesting because, visually, the logo, and I did some like logo research to see if AXA had a different brand or brand colors before. The one you see in the film is not the official logo, corporate logo, or brand that you see anywhere else. And I was not able to find, again, any indication that they had used that brand previously. So it seems like there's a there that can't all be, completely coincidental. But again, nothing to validate it, but those are my like 3 push pins or however many it is, to say maybe there was a there, maybe, again, with front of shirt being so endemic to soccer, they probably wanted to add to that realism, even for a women's amateur team, they wanted a brand there. So the way I saw this happening is like, well, who do we put on there? And maybe they did fish around for some paid product placement. Obviously, we see other brands in the film.
Yep.
But I thought maybe it was just conversation, whoever was on site for the FA to kind of help with adding whatever realism to the soccer content in the film was like, why don't we just put, AXA on there? They just spent 25 million pounds with us, but let's not make it overly corporate. So we'll change their logo a little bit.
Yeah, so you mentioned some product placement in the film, and this is something that I wanted to touch on because, to your point about push pins in a map and, doing a little bit of digging into the film, I was always one of those guys, I don't know about you, that would watch the end credits of films just to look at actors' names and things like that. And so in this particular instance, pretty beneficial to watch the end credits because at the very end of those, 3 minutes in, they start going through promotional consideration and there's a thank you page. And so a lot of the companies that I was tagging going through the film that have recognition on the pitch, around the stadium, and then the one that we're focused on for this one, AXA, and we believe is intended to be the front of shirt sponsor for this particular team. Although, as you note, going back to 2002 or even before, their logo has always been the same. They haven't changed it. They didn't go through a brand refresh at any point over the past 20 some years. So the logo is definitely different than what is used by the company now and then compared to what's used on screen in the film, which I spend a significant amount of time doing the same thing you did, which is figuring out what is that brand's relationship to the film? Because, as you mentioned, their support of the FA included support of the women's leagues at the time.
Yeah.
That was part of that relationship, and that would have included a separate FA Championship Cup in some of the articles that I found from the time period in the late 90s. So when the Hounslow Harriers, in the context of the film, play for the championship, that would have been an AXA sponsored event for the league that they would have been playing in at the time, even though it's amateur. And especially now the league that the team in Hounslow, which, as it turns out, there is one, plays in, that would have had some brand recognition. And so I think they were trying to make it look authentic and that there would be a front of shirt sponsor. And there are actual companies for opposing teams that have front of shirt sponsors that are actual companies. So this is interesting now that we're diving into this. Do you want to go through the brands here?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I had one comment and one question.
Sure.
And then I want to get into the brands. I think that's right. So with the Football Association sponsorship, the FA Cup, which is this massive tournament for men's football, an anchor entitlement, AXA, to the FA Cup. So I think they were the presenting sponsor of the FA Cup. So again, going back to kind of the realism and credibility, AXA was probably one of the biggest sponsors associated with soccer at that time. I mean, you obviously had the Premier League, and Barclays was involved, interestingly, a company in financial services still involved with the Premier League.
It seems like those companies are the ones that tend to support UK soccer over the years. It seems like it's financial services as a category and then insurers as another category. And the companies in those categories change, but those seem to be a focus. Do you know if there's a reason for that?
No, I mean, I think obviously financial services, in the UK and beyond is always like an active category of sponsorship. As far as like why, specifically, I think still today, but especially at that time, you had, financial services or financial services adjacent, categories and companies sponsoring soccer. I mean, I think as we go back to kind of the turn of the millennium and even before that, right? If you just kind of track active categories, those were kind of the easy targets, right? They were the ones that had a lot of money.
Right.
Their business was money, and they would invest in sport, arguably with probably not many objectives in mind, but they had the budgets to spend. They wanted to drive awareness of their brands, whether they were B2C or B2B. And I think just, fast forwarding now 20 some odd years later, obviously the sponsorship industry has advanced a lot more. A lot of other categories and brands have gotten more savvy and know how to drive results through sponsorship strategies. So not a great answer, but I think, it was highly prevalent, probably the top sponsoring category in the UK and other places around that time. And still to this day to some extent.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it doesn't seem completely out of character for a team like Hounslow to have a financial services provider, which in this case, if you look on the wall, their banner toward the midfield line in their stadium, which I found, by the way, we can dive into that, the real one. It says that they offer pensions. It says AXA Pensions, which is a product that's offered by the real AXA, but seems to be reasonable that type of company in that particular community would want to target the audience attracted by that particular team, which seems to be pretty true and in sync with, at the turn of the millennium, what companies would sponsor those types of opportunities. So it makes sense that AXA would be there. We can get into missed opportunities, but I think the real AXA having a presence on that team makes sense, but they did have a presence within the league just at a much higher level. And so the question is, who would have been that sponsor there? And I actually know at least a little bit through doing some research what company was actually investing in leagues at that level in that particular area. So I think that'll be interesting. But you were to finish your thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Well, one thing I noted, as far as the not just why sponsorship, but why would somebody like AXA or even a financial services company, sponsor a women's amateur football team in the UK at that time? And I think, you can expand it to just like brands investing in women's sport, in women's soccer in general. You think at the time, and a lot has been made about this more recently, where I've heard many people smarter than me say you should be investing in women's sport and women's soccer because it makes business sense,
right? Not
because you think it's like, goodwill or some kind of cause kind of piece. And I think, historically, not all brands, but certainly a lot of brands have sponsored women's sport and women's soccer more as we have to do that. It almost like borders on the charitable kind of side of things, right? Like not looking at it as a business investment, more as kind of a PR or CSR investment where, and this has changed not just over the last 20 years, but I'd say over the last like 3 or 4 years, an AXA now would probably want to sponsor, a women's soccer team or certainly leagues. And they do for the business case there, not as goodwill, not as like, let's like badge, the front of this shirt and be heroes in the local community and kind of, to some extent virtue signal that we support women's sport, but actually invest in it, have it as part of their like core objectives to know what they want to get out of that from a business and marketing standpoint. The credits, and shame on me, I don't always sit through the credits. I try to, and I didn't, and I should have, knowing the context of this conversation, knowing, there might have been some promotional considerations listed at the end. Usually I only sit through credits if I think there's going to be like, that extra scene or hidden scene or blooper reel. But I'm curious who was mentioned actually having promotional consideration, insinuating that means paid consideration to be in the film.
Yeah, so there was a handful of them. So let's talk about sort of how this film was made on a shoestring budget. Even for 2002, they made this movie for $6 million. And so one of the things I was looking for when we got to the credits was to see if there was some promotional consideration. And we touch on this a little bit in the Jurassic World podcast that I did with Dan Coates, because that film in particular has had promotional tie-ins forever. And there are lots of films that do that. In fact, the Mercedes-Benz partnership in that particular movie is part of a larger overarching real world studio deal with the company. But for this particular film, being a much smaller budget, being more or less an indie film that was being created sort of on as I mentioned, a shoestring budget, there would have been promotional consideration that helped pay for some of the expenses of the film, right? And I get that there are varying sentiments from people that aren't within the sponsorship industry about having brands being integrated into film. And that's part of what we'll talk about as we go through this podcast and cover other films and other media where sponsorship is mentioned fictionally. the real world brand support, and one of the proponents of this, and I don't know where you stand, Tom, on Michael Bay, but Michael Bay has said for things like the Transformers films, which are basically one giant ad for a product, tying in real auto manufacturers into those films. And he has said, this is how I put the big booms up on the screen and you get all these sweet graphics for these films, is I take promotional consideration to incorporate these into the film, and it becomes part of the experience. And for films that I make, that helps me do what I want to do. And so in this case, I was expecting, with a smaller budget, it being a sports film, sports being a huge attractor for corporate sponsorship, especially when you're looking at exposure around things like UK football, expected there would be some brands in here. So to answer your question, I'll go through a few of these, and then I want to go through the venue because I think it relates to the brands that are there. So going through this film, paused a few times to see if I could catch, especially some of the montage scenes, the brands that were recognized in the background.
Yep.
And so I'm going to go through just a list of them, and then I'm going to point out which ones were actual promotional considerations. So Crescent Building Supplies, which is in Hillingdon. AXA Pensions is mentioned there towards midfield. Wings Luxury Travel, Brazilian Soccer School, Flex, Pro Build, Lucozade Sport, Mayframes, Ryman, Carlsbad, Snickers, Tops Totes, UX Bridge, Minerva, Ealing Sports, FC Asphalt, and Autoglass. Now, out of those, some that were mentioned in the closing credits are Lucozade Sport, which makes sense, Carlsbad, and Snickers. So those were promotional consideration for the film that were worked in organically onto the field. Now, for the other companies that I mentioned, also real, but not real for the Hounslow Harriers. So the venue that they filmed this in is no longer in use for soccer leagues, at least from what I can tell, but it was called the Warren. And it's in Hounslow. It has a capacity of 3,500. So it's the one that's actually on screen. It's where they filmed all the scenes. The team, and I don't know if you noticed this, when they get on the bus to take them to the airport so that they could fly to Germany in the film, it says Yeading FC on the side. So Yeading FC is the team that played in the Warren, and they're a feeder team, like 7th or 8th in the pyramid, and they are now Hayes and Yeading United FC. Now, for posterity, their shirt sponsor was Taylor Woodrow, and that's a construction company. So in 2001, 2002, 2003, they had a front of shirt sponsor for the Yeading FC, which was Taylor Woodrow. But those other brands appear to be, although it's tough to confirm this 22 years later, the brands that are there that aren't promotional consideration are sponsors
of Yeading FC.
Yeah, because they change depending on when they film. So I'm assuming that when they shot the soccer scenes, which if you go back and read the 20th anniversary sort of history of the film, which was from a couple of years ago where they talk about making of the film, the director mentions that in the script, she was not a soccer fan,
right,
and didn't know anything about the sport. So she would put in jargon, football jargon, anywhere that she needed to have something relating to the sport itself. And then she relied on experts while they were filming to fill in the gaps on that to make it seem realistic, which I thought was fascinating. But given that, I assumed that she was filming on days where they could have people in the stands as far as extras and make use of all the promotional consideration and things that were on the film to make it look like a real experience for the Hounslow Harriers. So those brands that are recognized are game day sponsors, I think, or year-round sponsors for Yeading FC, which would have been the real team that was playing in the stadium where the Hounslow Harriers fictional team are playing.
That's fascinating. Yeah, no, I did not have that little tidbit or those tidbits come up in my research, but that's interesting. As far as the sponsors, I noticed you had a much longer list, which I'm not surprised. I did have Snickers, I did have Lucozade or Lucozade, and I don't know if you mentioned the apparel sponsors, but that was going to be one of my questions to you since you saw the promotional considerations. It seemed to run the gamut, so I assumed none of that was paid. I think even on the same team, even for the Hounslow Harriers, you saw like Adidas and Mitre and
Yep.
maybe one other apparel brand. So I assume none of those apparel companies came up as paid consideration.
So her friend wears People's Wardrobe. That has consideration. Mitre was recognized. Adidas obviously recognized. Apologies for the omission there. I was looking at that purely from who's recognized on the field, which I thought was a pretty organic way to recognize them on the pitch, was to have a banner somewhere on screen that really is a true organic integration for a product into a film like this. So yeah, it's a great point. Those brands were definitely mentioned as part of that. And some of them, and this goes back to your and my time when we both worked at IEG and we were looking at, product placement valuations. Some of the brands need that type of recognition. I think it's an important point for those that are listening. Not every product placement in a film is paid necessarily, especially for bigger films, and it depends on the time period when that brand appears. So around the mid-aughts, Apple didn't need to pay to have promotional consideration for an iPhone on screen, either on TV or film, because it was an in-demand product, and so they didn't need to pay to have their product placed in that medium. But for a company like a soft drink definitely needs the association with either a sport or the property to draw attention and create positive sentiment around its brand. And so the companies like that, so I would assume, Lucozade, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is one of those brands that would want the affiliation with sport to create a positive affiliation for that brand with UK women's football. And I think that would be a paid consideration, which it certainly seems to be as far as the thank you and the credits are concerned. So that would be one that I think was paid. Adidas, it seems like, was certainly part of the film. And then People's Wardrobe, I would assume, is promotional consideration, since there is a thank you acknowledgement and brand recognition on the screen. But there are certainly brands that are going to just organically be picked up just through the filming of the movie, different types of jeans, the shops that they go to, which I believe is in Piccadilly. Those types of stores, I don't think, receive any sort of thank you. And notably, AXA does not receive an acknowledgement in the thank you either. So
yeah, I think couple thoughts there, but one thing that's interesting to me, at least, about the brands that did, the companies and the brands that did pay to appear in the film. And, I'm not going to go out on a limb and call any of these like brands, brave for associating with this content. But, even thinking about 2002, I mean, a film that's, still comedic, in places, and lighthearted and feel good, and a lot of just kind of fun themes. I mean, it tackles homophobia, it tackles discrimination and racism, it tackles, I want to say anti-woman, but we see, even when Jess is playing with that group that she plays with in the park, they say some choice things that are not being elevated to be, clever in the film at the time either. I think they're making a point of kind of this like, male, almost toxic culture. And, I think if that film was made today, like without commenting on, I guess, the consumer's reaction to that film, like would brands associate with those themes, right? Again, I don't want to use brave, but I think it's interesting for those brands that did intentionally get integrated into the movie. I think it's an interesting choice because, again, I think today, and the political climate's a little different today, I'm not sure how many brands would want to associate with those themes, candidly. I think it's a feel-good film. It was well received by critics and the viewing public. But again, just an interesting perspective I came away with, watching the film this time most recently with that context.
I want to look at this the way we would do a traditional valuation. So I want to look at where do they play, what league is the team in, how would they do it then, how would they do it now? And then how much would a company pay to do that? Whether it's AXA, which in this case sounds like it's a fictional representation of a real company that actually supported the FA. And then what companies would do that now? And I think we could do that relatively quickly here, at least to give the audience an idea of how we approach this stuff. So the Warren, as I mentioned, there's a 3,500 capacity. Now, the real Hounslow team is called the Hounslow Tridents, they have a front of shirt sponsor. So I can't tell whether the team is still active, but they were as of the 2022-23 season because they were seeking sponsorship. But they did have a front of shirt sponsor called Connected Curb, and that's an EV charging point provider. And the article I found talking about that relationship was quoting a woman by the name of Isabel James, who's the head of their residential. And she also, from an amateur standpoint, played football. And so her team, where she was the head of the residential programs for Connected Curb, sponsored her football team, which happened to be the Hounslow Women's FC, the mascot for which is the Tridents. So they did have a front of shirt sponsor. In 23, it was an EV charging company that was investing in local communities, and one of the players on the team was the head of that initiative. So it makes sense that they would be there. Similar to what we were talking about for insurance companies and financial services providers in the early 2000s. So that right there is an indication of sort of how the industry has changed and what brands are investing in those communities. As it relates to the field itself, so looking at some of the assets, they do sell sponsorship packages. And this is what I want to talk about in terms of the traditional definition of when people think of sponsorship, it tends to be just pay for something or put a logo on something. When it comes to determining what the fees would be for these types of opportunities, when it comes to a community level and just sport in general, and I've mentioned this before when we were doing Jurassic World, it's tough to find benchmarks for pro sports because a lot of them are private organizations, and the same is true for these like local clubs too. They're privately owned and don't necessarily disclose fees. Some of them will put up price points for different types of opportunities on their website, things like that. But not a whole lot of information as to what companies actually pay to do it. And it's because, in my opinion, they're so woven into the fabric of the communities they play in, I don't think it necessarily matters. I think the understanding is the brands are there to help the team succeed. And as we mentioned with some of the teams even that popped up in the research, sponsorship is a huge component to helping them travel to Germany as they do in this film, helping them pay for uniforms, and that recognition is an acknowledgement of without this company's support. And this article I found about the current Hounslow Women's FC and their current sponsorship, the same is true there. This is a local company that invests in its local football club, even at an amateur level in the UK in this particular community. And so there isn't a whole lot of information about fees out there, but there is a lot of exposure. Sorry, I'll...
No, it's interesting. So an interesting bit that was actually part of my, again, push pins. So the Hounslow Women's FC team that is real, that is nicknamed the Tridents, they were actually formed by a merger for two previous women's teams, one of which was QPR women's team. QPR is a football club in the UK that has a men's team that has at times been at the top tier of the Premier League. But QPR is actually mentioned in the movie, which is really what some of my homework was to actually, try and, I'll use the word triangulate, even if I'm using it incorrectly, figure out where the fictional Hounslow Harriers would have played, because they mentioned they had an upcoming match against QPR. Now, granted, it was tournament style, like the format they were playing, so it wasn't even in the context of a league, was my understanding. I kept hearing them talk about tournaments, whether that was a league or something else organized across different divisions and levels of UK women's soccer at the time. I don't know. But the QPR women's FC team in 2002 would have been, somewhere around the fourth tier of UK women's soccer at the time. I could be completely wrong. If we have listeners that are experts in UK women's soccer, please correct us. But that was part of my process. The reason I mention it now is as I was, noodling over this question of, even in that context, like what tier are we talking about? What a sponsorship range might have been for a front of shirt, front of kit kind of positioning. That was one input for me.
Yeah. So I'm glad you bring that up, and I'm glad you found that, because one of my questions to you before we even started recording was, so where would the Hounslow Harriers would have played? And I started looking at different teams, and I think it's worth mentioning because they say something in the film. Joe, in particular, their coach, played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, says that he's being attracted to the men's side of the club.
Yep.
And there was a women's side of the Yeading FC team as well. And so that's initially where I started researching were teams like Oxford United, which have teams in the league that the Hounslow Harriers would have played in 2002, but they have a men's side, a women's side, a junior side, and then it's U18, U17, U16, and it looks like that goes all the way up to U23. And maybe that's, again, there are certainly experts in UK football, which feel free to correct us and let us know if this isn't true. But it seems like they would have been a semi-professional league that's part of the feeder team. You're saying it's fourth tier. I think that makes sense. It seems like it's seventh, eighth tier, some of the smaller teams. And it seems like looking at Oxford United, for example, they have women on their team that range anywhere from 16 to 39, depending on how well you play and how good of an athlete you are. And the other thing is they're all under contract. So in the film, talking about, how fictional deals are made, Jules just inviting Jess to go play on the team and try out. And he said, yeah, go ahead and just come back for the next practice, and they give her a jersey. That isn't how that works. It sounds like these players are signed, even on the amateur side. And point being, the real Hounslow team, they actually play in Hanworth. And it says their division is the FA Women's National League Southern Premier Division.
Yep.
Is where she currently, or where the Hounslow currently plays, which play both Oxford United, they play the London Bees of various teams. It seems like it's all sort of intermingled, and they all play at various levels of competition, even though they're in different rankings. And then there's the whole promotion element to it too, where they would have been elevated had they had as good of a season in 2002. Right. Yeah.
And no, for sure. Interesting bits there. And yeah, I think that the FA Women's National League Southeast or whatever, that aligns, that it was like the third or fourth tier, depending on exactly what time frame you were looking at. But I think it's important to note, and I think we said at the top of the pod, even the top tier of that soccer pyramid at the time, which probably wasn't even a neat, very symmetrical pyramid,
right?
That was still semi-professional at that point.
Yeah.
So, when you think about, they mentioned the WUSA Women's Soccer League, which unfortunately folded shortly thereafter. It kind of came
like the next year, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was formed, I think, right on the backs of the U.S. Women's World Cup win in '99.
Yeah.
Was already being planned, obviously, well before that, but then it folded, unfortunately. But certainly the top tier of women's soccer in the UK at the time was not seen as a viable career move, right? Which is why they were looking abroad and talking about the WUSA and, eventually, obviously, getting recruited by Santa Clara University, because even at the top of the pyramid for UK women's football, there wasn't really an opportunity to make a career out of it.
And it sounds like they allude in the film that they're trying to change that, which is why Joe stays as the coach of the women's team instead of the assistant coach on the men's side, because he said he's tired of the Yanks stealing all their best players. Yeah. So it sounds like he's trying to take the Hounslow Harriers professional, at least to elevate them and really focus on that part of the club as it relates to false market value.
Yes.
To sort of wrap things up and put a bow on our conversation. So let me share some stats with you for the Warren. So that's actually situated along the A312 in London. And so the vehicular traffic along that freeway. So let's just say, if you look at some of the benefits that are provided to AXA, midfield signage on the field, front of shirt sponsor, they get some sort of recognition, which I don't know if it's I believe they call it a friendly that they're playing in Germany, but it seems a lot of these teams just play each other, especially in England or in the UK, rather than travel outside of that. Although there is a similarly structured system for women's soccer or women's football in Germany. That was also part of the research I did in preparation for this. But it seems like a lot of their games are played in and around their particular market. So the Southern Division, for example, which I believe the Hounslow Harriers would have played in, would have just stayed in the southern part of the UK, but they also go up to Manchester and Liverpool, and there's other, teams. And it seems like they will travel to play each other, but they're a couple of hours away, by car or by train to get to these other markets. So they tend to stay local. So with that in mind, they would have played a lot of their games, I believe, at the Warren or at a local field within the confines of London or in one of the surrounding boroughs of London. And so the A312 to my point, in 2002, the vehicular traffic was about 26,000 cars a day. In 2017, which is the last measure count, it's actually decreased to 23,000. Then there's a cross street called the Broadway, which is on the other side of the stadium. And in 2003, which was the earliest recorded measurement, at least I could find that's closest to the time period, was a little bit more than 13,000 cars per day. In 2002, 1.59 people per vehicle. So you're looking at...
This is beyond research. That's impressive to have average annual daily traffic counts. You did more research than me. That's fantastic.
So annual potential universe of impressions here for any of these, local clubs, which, as we mentioned, they're there to help the club succeed and to support the local community. That doesn't mean that the exposure value that they're getting isn't far beyond what they're getting, especially for someone like AXA, the real AXA. If they had something at midfield and you could see it from the highway, just the impressions from one of those roads alone would have been over 15 million impressions potentially just from the cars going by. It's a 3,500 capacity. If you look at some of the attendance records, at least from, I think some of this was impacted by the pandemic, but 20, 21, 22, 60, 70 people per game, especially at those lower levels, which I think were, community folks that are invested in their local amateur club. But there's a lot of exposure value even at a smaller level, but I don't think the pricing for those sponsorship packages has changed much. I went back to 2013 to look at, back of shirt or player sponsorships or match sponsorships. It all seems pretty consistent. So a player sponsorship is anywhere from $90 to $150 for a specific player for the year. You can also sponsor the back of the shirt, which I'm looking at one of the teams in the Isthmian League, and they actually have the rear of the shirt sponsor. I believe it was about £1,800 for the back of the shirt sponsorship. And that would have been for this year. So for the 23 season, it was about £1,800 to do the back of the shirt sponsorship.
That's a steal.
The front of the shirt sponsorship was already sold. I completely agree with you. I think that's the takeaway here. If we can cut to the chase, I'm thinking front of the shirt sponsorship, just looking at how pricing has changed. So if you go back, even 10 years, it was $90 to $150 to sponsor a player. It's still $90 to $150 to sponsor a player. I'm assuming the back of the shirt sponsorship, just based on the research that we've done, would have been about the same, right? And just because the market for corporate sponsorship has changed, the companies that are involved in sponsorship of this sport in the UK and just sport in general, what that looks like has changed over the years. The landscape has changed over the years. The sport itself has changed over the past 20 years, but it seems like the sponsorship values for these local amateur clubs have stayed pretty consistent. And so with that in mind, I'm thinking AXA, if this were a real team in 2002, would have paid somewhere around 5,000 US, maybe a little bit less, for the front of the shirt sponsorship, which seems to be pretty consistent. So Some of the teams, one of them, the front of the shirt sponsor was, as I mentioned, for the Hounslow FC now, is an electric charging station. Another one is a local auto body shop that works on, Mercedes and other sort of like luxury vehicles. But these are smaller one shop organizations in that particular community that are supporting their local team. And
yeah, absolutely.
They're not going to have large sponsorship dollars, and they're not necessarily buying it based on exposure value like larger professional sports, which if you want to go look at, English Premier League, what sponsors are paying to sponsor those teams for the front of the shirt. I mean, it's $5, $10, $50 million a year, depending on the team. And those are massive deals. But even at the lower levels of this sport, there are local companies that are investing, and it's a huge value to creating career pathways for the women that play the sport. And I think it's not based on the exposure value that you would get for some of the bigger professional leagues, in my opinion. I think it's more investing in the community. And as such, I think it's around probably 5,000 US, I think, currently to do front of shirt, although I can't find anything to confirm that based on the research I did.
Yeah. Came at it a couple different ways. But yeah, I had $5,000 to $10,000 as my false market value estimate for that deal. And I don't know if AXA has branches, but right, as far as thinking about where the deal might have originated, right? This was not going to be a national or corporate deal, right? It would be somebody that has presence in the community through a retail branch or otherwise, right? So that obviously lowers the amount invested. And to your point, it was going to be probably based on team need and ask, right? To just like exist versus any kind of mathematical or data-driven assessment of, impressions-based value. So Yeah, 5 to 10,000.
Although we might argue that they should look at it that way.
Yeah, they should have.
The sponsorship industry between 2002 and 2023 on average, it's increasing between 4 and 5% a year, especially in terms of pricing at the highest level of the sport. Even at the lower levels, there should still be some escalation in what those cost. And I think that would help support the teams. But as you just said, it's not necessarily based on what the value, or in this case, the false market value of these opportunities would be worth to the team in terms of exposure, to the sponsor in terms of exposure. It's based on the ask. It's based on support for the local community. It's based on finding local community partners that want to have the recognition with a local team and not necessarily national exposure. But that isn't how these deals are done. Yeah. And I think for that reason, there hasn't really been an escalation from 2002 to now at that level. I think it's still pretty consistent, and it's just part of community support, and everyone expects front of shirt sponsor is going to be something that probably changes out from year to year. And I think the companies that do that, it's sort of a point of pride that they were once the front of shirt sponsor for the Hounslow FC. And I think that changes hands probably every couple of years. And I think it's part of the point of pride is the local community, business community rallies around these teams to support the women that play the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just, thinking about 2002, right? And the channels and the opportunities to generate impressions and, awareness and eyeballs, even, with a pretty nascent World Wide Web at the time, your impressive traffic analysis notwithstanding, there's so many ways, right? Especially for a local community team to generate that kind of awareness, right?
Right.
You had the front of kit, you had a field board. We didn't see much of anything else in terms of highly visible on-site exposure, but digital wasn't going to drive it. Social didn't exist. As far as earned media coverage, that was the interesting bit when I didn't remember that from my first few viewings of the movie, but where I'm trying to remember now, is it Jess's dad actually sees the Germany friendly in the local paper, granted, but I'm like, okay, well, they're getting coverage, so it's notable. Whether or not that would have happened, in 2002, who knows? But that was that was the earned media piece there for AXA, but not much else. So I think even all else equal, today, obviously, they'd have a lot more opportunity, even putting aside, the increased interest in women's sport and the changing of the soccer pyramid in the UK, which would put this team at a more professional level. My number for today, if we were getting to that, would hopefully be closer to a $25,000 to $50,000 sponsorship, assuming they followed the market with those annual increases that you mentioned.
Yep.
Assuming that the sponsorship package would have broadened with kind of more impressions-based assets and exposure and opportunities, as well as, hopefully some hospitality, which probably was not part of the package in 2002. I don't know, who you would have hosted.
I didn't see any Lucasad folks out at the stadium.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, that's where I would peg the deal today, with a lot of caveats. Hopefully we would trickle up to, $25K plus for a front of shirt at that tier.
And you mentioned an important point, the internet being in the nascent stages that it was in 2002, although some of the listeners here will say there was a point where the internet wasn't as robust as it is now. There was no social media yet, at least not in any significant form, where it was widely adopted. But now those are the things that drive this. I mean, even the information that I found on the Hounslow Tridents now, the women's FC now, is all driven through social. And there is some experiences where they bring the sponsor out to the field and they join them for their last game of the year. And there's some hospitality things like you're talking about. And that's always going to be part of, especially as a sponsorship like that. But it seems like a lot of the value is being driven by the social and the digital components, which 20 years ago they didn't. So that's sort of changed. And that, of course, as you know, those types of assets carry the largest rates in terms of exposure value when you're looking at digital and mobile interstitials and social media integration, depending on what it is and depending on what channel it is. I mean, TikTok is astronomical right now. If you do a promoted campaign on TikTok, same with Instagram, those types of opportunities are going to add value above and beyond what they would have been able to do in 2002. So I would agree with you. I think the ask would be, in the $25,000 to $50,000 range if they were staying consistent with those values should be for a team like that, which would have a huge impact on an amateur women's football team in the UK right now, especially at this level, because of the need that they have to increase the sport. Last question. If AXA was the FA Cup sponsor between 1998 and 2002, and they included as part of that agreement their support of an FA Women's Cup, and in 2002 the fictional Hounslow Harriers would have advanced to that FA Cup, would AXA, the fake company, have been able to receive recognition as the shirt sponsor at an FA Cup sponsored by the real AXA?
Wow, that is not what I was expecting. Would the fake, so to boil it down, would the fake AXA as a shirt sponsor of a team that qualified for a women's FA Cup sponsored by the actual AXA, would there be any like competitive conflict or IP conflict or category conflict?
Yeah, so let's assume that they're just not the same company.
Yeah.
In the fictional universe that the movie takes place, would the real AXA have looked at the shirt sponsor and said, I don't think we can allow them on here, even though it's a different logo?
Yeah.
I don't think we can get them recognition around the event. Would they have to change the front of shirt sponsor? Would they have to go someone else?
That would be, first of all, from the fake AXA, a fascinating, very heavy-handed version of ambush marketing.
Right.
Literally going by the same letters. And as far as the real AXA, I'd assume they'd shut that down. I mean, we saw what kind of money was spent by the real AXA with the FA Cup. They want to protect their IP first and foremost, and then their investment in association with the FA Cup. So even the insinuation that there's another AXA out there, I don't know. I guess I could see the positive, changing my mind that maybe they'd see that the average consumer would think that was the same AXA. So maybe it's like added value, added exposure for them. I guess that's the flip side. Maybe they would see it as advantageous potentially. So that's my half-hearted answer.
I think it's a perfect answer because I'm of two minds on it too. On one hand, I could see them saying, we don't want a company that has such a similar logo to ours to have recognition at an event that we sponsor. And we know that during the pandemic, some of the teams in real life at that league level donated their sponsorship of the shirt to a local organization to raise awareness for them, simply because they didn't have the same exposure value, and I don't think they were sold, so they donated that space to local organizations. They could have done something like that. So I think that might have been a potential arrangement that they had landed on, where they raised awareness for some cause in 2002, important to the Hounslow Harriers or important to Jess Mender or Jules, to receive recognition at a cup in a championship event that was sponsored by AXA. On the other hand, and I think this might be true of the film too, if I'm AXA, am I necessarily worried if the logo is different, if it's still driving traffic to my site? Because it was confusing even for me, having worked in the industry for a while, having had some exposure with that brand before, to figure out if that was actually the brand or not. And as it turns out, it's a fictional representation of a real brand, I think is where we sort of landed on that, but not the same company. And I think they're still getting the exposure value without necessarily paying for a sponsorship to have that association with the team. So it probably doesn't work out that poorly for them on the brand side, because I think people still assume it's the same AXA, even though it's technically not.
I wish we could go back and do a sponsor recall survey after that movie, whether aided or unaided, to see kind of, what comes back there. Because, I wonder realistically, right, if AXA did get a bump, right, whatever that was, whether it was traffic to their website or interest, or if anything came of it, or if it was, a big nothing burger. But, for me, I think
both in the fiction universe of the movie and in the real universe in which the film was released, I think AXA probably received an uptick in traffic, especially around that time.
Yeah. I will say this in the context of the film, and I think this goes back to my earlier comment on realism, if that makes the cut in the pod, and your comments on Michael Bay. Even though we watch movies a lot of time to escape, right, and we have to suspend our disbelief, I personally prefer real brands in my movies, because for me it's actually jarring to see like a generic version of cornflakes or whatever other product in a movie. I prefer, for what it's worth, to actually see real life brands in movies, because that adds the realism to me. And I think for soccer context, and again, this is probably for a different pod, but the MLS, there is research and studies to support this. They actually achieved more credibility once they became more commercialized, right, with real brands on their chest. That actually, whether it was intended or not, that's what helped the MLS gain credibility, because you're used to seeing brands, and real brands, of course, for international soccer teams and clubs. So once the MLS did that, it became more real. Like, this is soccer, because you're used to seeing that. So not a direct parallel there, but again, answering a question that you didn't ask, but for what it's worth.
I think it's a great point to end on, and I'll ask you this too. I know in your current role at Legends, if we can use this as sort of our closing, I know when we were first talking about this particular podcast and doing this film together, you had said, Legends is really throwing its full support behind women in sport. What does that look like for you moving forward, and as it might relate to the context of this particular podcast?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I'll answer that on a couple different fronts. From a company culture standpoint, Legends, they're really interested and passionate about women's sport, right? And just women's causes. So we actually have some great organizations internally, including one called the League of Legendary Women, which is basically like a resource for employees. Yes, and pun fully intended with legends in the name there. That's the fun of being part of a company called Legends.
That's great.
But it's basically an employee resource group that churns out some content, organizes events and initiatives, and really rallies around, women's empowerment and women in sport, which is great. And that is, again, not just virtuous signaling. They live that. On the business standpoint and related, just to show how they live it, Legends has a private equity owner named Sixth Street, who actually, has a sizable investment in the newly announced National Women's Soccer League team called Bay FC, which also has ownership from some wonderful and famous former U.S. women's national team soccer players. And Legends gets to help basically launch that team, right, from a commercial standpoint, right, and sponsorship strategy and all that, which is awesome. One of my favorite projects, again, and these are not plugs, but they're, I think important to the dialogue, and where I come from professionally, beyond just being a girl dad, being passionate about women's sport. We work with the United Soccer League, the USL, which is a tier below MLS in the soccer pyramid or ecosystem here. I shouldn't call it a pyramid because they're unrelated leagues. Right. One of the big initiatives that we're working on with them is their announcement and launch of the USL Super League, which will be actually a Division I women's professional soccer league in the US alongside the NWSL. And again, just, working with the folks that live and breathe the creation and planning and strategy for initiatives like that. It's just awesome. It's professionally fulfilling. It's still personally fulfilling as a soccer fan and as a girl dad. So yeah, just lots of cool stuff going on at Legends. So I, again, wouldn't be doing what I do if I wasn't passionate about it. So it's fun to talk soccer here, but also, from a day-to-day business standpoint, get to work in soccer and more importantly for me, get to work in women's soccer as well.
I'm happy to hear that those are some of the projects that you're working on, because I think it's important for us to note how Legends is making, that impact within the community and, being thought leaders in this particular sport and in women's empowerment in general. And so I think it's a great note to end on.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for the time. This has been fun. Went in directions I didn't expect, and I say that in the best possible way, but I think those are the best conversations.
This has been False Market Value. If you have a suggestion for a fictional sponsorship deal that you would like us to feature in a future episode of False Market Value, you can email your ideas to info@quantllc.net. I'm Ross Kennerly, and we'll see you next time.